Night in the medieval city was a creature with many eyes and careful hands, and if you followed its gaze through the crooked lanes toward the riverfront, you would find the quarter where lamps burned later than anywhere else, where shutters were painted in warm colors and doors carried marks that did not appear on guild ledgers, where the sound of laughter sat beside the clink of coins and the shuffle of soft-soled shoes on worn stone. Here the brothel was not a single idea, but a layered marketplace of comforts, performances, and carefully negotiated illusions. A place where what you could be offered depended on your purse, your station, your appetite for risk, and the unwritten rules that kept pleasure from tipping into scandal. The madam or the keeper met you first, not with a promise, but with a weighing of your manner, a glance that measured cloak and boots and dirt beneath the nails, for reputation began at the threshold, and what came next depended on whether you arrived as an anonymous traveler seeking warmth, a guildsman with coin to spare after a good season, a clerk who could read but not yet afford indiscretion, or a lordling whose guard waited in the street. Inside the common room, the air was a blend of spiced wine, cheap resin incense, rushes newly strewn on the floor to hide old smells, a lute trying to thread a melody through the low hum of talk, and the quiet governance of servants who watched without staring, tending to cups and candles, because light and drink were the first offerings any house sold, both priced to keep you seated a little longer. You could be offered anonymity before anything else. A corner screened by linen, a hood you did not need to remove, a name to use that was not yours. For the city ran on memory and rumor, and the brothel's primary trade was not simply bodies, but discretion. The sealing of mouths with courtesy and coin. You could be offered company that looked like conversation and sounded like attention. A practiced art in which a listener made room for the concerns of merchants and soldiers and scribes whose daily lives allowed no softness. The talk shaped your station, so that the baker heard about ovens and saints' days, while the captain heard about river depths and the mood of the docks. And for some, this was the whole of the visit, a purchased hour in which the world pretended to care. You could be offered music, not as tavern clamor, but as private performance. A voice tuned to ballads that skirted the line between romance and prayer, or an instrument coaxed to tenderness so that the coarser laughter from the street faded and the room seemed briefly like a chamber at court. You could be offered baths, a luxury that hid itself as hygiene, tubs hauled from a back room, kettles brought to a steam that smelled faintly of lavender if the house had patrons wealthy enough to import oil, or of crushed rosemary if it did not. Attendants who knew their craft well enough to keep eyes down and tasks efficient. And if you were nervous, the keeper would say that cleanliness pleased not only the senses but the saints, and the lie would be gentle enough to pass. You could be offered safety, which was both vow and warning, for the guard at the door was employed to keep drunks from turning violent, and also to remind you that the house answered to someone who shared bread with the watch, to a parish priest who preferred coin to outrage, perhaps to a reeve who closed eyes in exchange for rent paid in neat stacks. And in this way, the offer you received included the promise that within these walls the city's roughness paused. You could be offered variety without vulgarity, a catalog spoken in euphemism like a curtain of silk, companionship of this age or that, of this tongue or that, roles played to ease the mind of men who wanted to try on other lives for an hour. Knight or poet or penitent, games of courtly flirtation whose ending remained within rules the house enforced, because brothels survived by learning the long arithmetic of danger and desire, by selling fantasy while refusing chaos. You could be offered costumes, scent, a scrap of ribbon to tie around your wrist as a token to carry back to your solitude, a glove pressed into your palm like a borrowed heartbeat, a verse written in a tidy, practiced hand that said nothing improper and everything implied. And these small objects were the second business of the house, souvenirs that allowed a man to leave with proof he had been seen. You could be offered food better than most taverns would risk after nightfall, bread still warm because the kitchen kept odd hours, stews kept mild to calm the stomachs of those who drank too quickly, sugared almonds or candied peels for patrons who like to display their purse, and for companions who like to coax the evening towards sweetness instead of noise. You could be offered masks for feast days when the city loosened its laces, when the watch walked slower and the guilds pretended not to count. And behind the masks you might purchase the chance to be no one for a night, to dance without lineage, to be chosen for wit rather than lineage or wage. And though the church thundered against such revels, the church's servants often came to the back door for mulled wine and reminded the keeper to keep transgression tidy and quiet. You could be offered privacy steeped in ritual, candles measured by finger widths so time had weight, curtains thick enough to hush a laugh, a small bell to ring if the mood turned. The rules spoken gently: no blows that leave marks, no blades except those worn by the guard, no promises that bind beyond the second candle because a house that kept its rules held its life. You could be offered healing of a kind people rarely admit they need, not in charms but in the patient labor of making someone feel less alone. And this too was priced, not only in coin but in the care with which the keeper protected her staff from the eddies of grief that could drown a room. For the brothel understood that loneliness was a dangerous wine and rationed it. You could be offered absolution dressed as jest, clever quips about saints with generous hearts who turned their faces away at midnight and returned at matins to pretend they saw nothing, and if you laughed too loudly the keeper's eyebrow would flicker, reminding you that blasphemy was cheap and fines were expensive. You could be offered safety measures unspoken in polite company, poultices and herbs, and practical counsel rumored to come from midwives who kept two ledgers, one for baptisms and one for debts of gratitude, because the brothel knew the cost of ignorance and the price of shame. And while no house wrote such things on its walls, everyone understood that a place that offered knowledge reduced the risk that drew magistrates like crows. You could be offered stagecraft, tableaux mal to flatter memory, companions dressed as ladies for men who had never dined beyond the market gate, or as shepherds for clerks who copied pastoral verses until their eyes burned. Gentle theater that let a patron try on the velvet of a different life, and then put it back on the peg without tearing it. You could be offered limits, which were more precious than the wine, because a brothel that said no was a brothel that would still be standing when the next levy of the watch came through, and you learned quickly that the keeper's word was the only law that mattered between checkered tiles and painted door, a law enforced by women and men who knew how to read the tilt of a hand and the temperature of a room faster than any sheriff. You could be offered a kind of charity disguised as decorum, bowls set aside for the poor who swept the stoop at dawn, old cloaks lent to girls whose luck ran thin in winter, a bed in the attic where an abandoned apprentice could sleep until a cousin was found, and the parish might grumble but also point people uphill when trouble came too fast. For the brothel was often the first place to learn whose rent was late, whose temper had turned, whose child was coughing in the night. You could be offered the illusion of control, the chance to make choices when the day had offered you none, to select a song, a wine, a story with a happy ending even if the city outside made different endings its trade. And if you stayed long enough, you learned that this was what most patrons actually bought. Not bodies, but possibility. An hour in which the script could be kind. And because the brothel sold possibility, it also sold memory, scents and sounds arranged, so that months later a merchant on the road would catch the breath of cinnamon from a market stall and feel briefly as if he had stepped again through that painted door, as if the lamplight had reached across the miles to insist that he had been, for a short time, gentler and more seen than the rest of his life allowed. None of this was simple or clean, and the house survived on the edge between sin named loudly and kindness named softly. Between the city's appetite and its need to pretend appetite came from elsewhere. But if you stood quietly by the stair, you would see that what a medieval brothel could offer was not one thing, but many braided together: privacy and spectacle, rule and indulgence, music and heat, careful boundaries, and the fragile courage to ask for tenderness. And you would understand why these places endured despite sermons and statutes. Because they learned the truth the city refused to write down, that people needed to be warmed, to be listened to be told a story in which they were worth a candle's light, and that for this they would pay and return and keep the secret as carefully as the house kept theirs. By the time the city bells marked midnight, the brothel quarter felt almost like another realm entirely, as if the narrow lanes and leaning walls had been lifted from the map and placed somewhere between the waking world and a dream stitched with candlelight. Here, the hierarchy of the outside was loosened, though never fully gone. For even in these walls, the subtle signs of rank clung to posture, accent, and the cut of a cloak. Yet the magic of the house lay in its ability to let a pauper feel momentarily like a prince, and a prince to feel, for once, like a man freed from the gaze of a court. In such a place, what you could be offered was carefully designed to make you forget the harsh disciplines of medieval life, the constant reckoning with hunger, the rigid expectations of church and guild, the ceaseless awareness that every action left a mark on your reputation. A patron might begin with the smallest of gestures, a cup of wine sweetened with honey to cut the bitterness of the taverns, and already the mood would shift. For honey was expensive enough to suggest care, and care itself was a luxury. If you lingered, you might be invited into one of the smaller chambers, each dressed in its own character. One might be hung with tapestries depicting courtly love in scenes borrowed from troubadour songs, another scented with amber and lit in deep reds to imitate the rooms of the Levantine merchants, another plain and clean, for clients who preferred not to feel they were stepping into a play. The offerings changed with the season. Winter brought braziers burning with fragrant wood, heavy blankets from the cloth hall, warm spiced milk. Summer brought bowls of cherries, cool water poured from pewter jugs, and light gauze hangings that stirred with the night air drifting in through high windows. For those of scholarly bent, the brothel might provide a companion versed in poetry or scripture, someone to debate with until the candles guttered. For those of military mind, there were companions skilled at listening to campaigns recounted and victories exaggerated without challenge. For pilgrims who strayed from the path, there were those who could speak of relics and shrines without judgment, weaving piety into the cadence of desire. And always, behind every offer, there was the subtle choreography of the keeper's hand and awareness of how to match patron and companion so that neither felt cheated. For a dissatisfied man could be more dangerous than a drunk one, and the preservation of the house's calm was a craft in itself. Here, too, you might be offered what the outside world would never admit: a glimpse into the freedom of those who work the house, who, despite the sermons against them, carved out spaces of influence and negotiation far beyond what the average market wife could claim. They knew the names of aldermen and thieves alike. They could have a rumor silenced before it reached the mayor's ear. They could arrange a meeting between merchant and smuggler that no guild official would dare witness. And this, too, was a currency the house sold. Some brothels offered more exotic amusements for those who could afford the risk. Costumes imported from Italian masquerades, music from Moorish courts played on instruments the church frowned upon, rare spices dusted over fruit so their scent lingered on the skin of the one who fed them to you. The wealthiest might be offered entertainments in which the line between theater and flesh blurred entirely, stagings of legendary romances where you played the knight or the lady, with your partner guiding the scene to a carefully arranged conclusion before the curtain of propriety fell again. And yet, even in these luxuries, the shadow of the city's law loomed. What was offered always skirted the limits of what the authorities would allow, and the keeper's art lay in knowing how far to go without bringing the watch crashing through the door. More practical offers came quietly: herbal infusions to calm a racing heart, salves for tired limbs, whispered advice about which tavern was safe after midnight, and which alley to avoid until the bishop's men had left town. For those who had more coin than they knew how to spend, there were tokens to take away: rings bought not for value but for the story they carried, ribbons scented with oils from across the sea, miniature carvings that fit in the palm like secrets. Even the humblest patrons might leave with something: a word of encouragement, a shared laugh, the feeling of being seen clearly and not condemned for it. And that, perhaps, was the most dangerous offer of all, for it was the one that made people return again and again, despite the risk, defying the edicts nailed to the church door, ignoring the whispers of neighbors, walking back through that painted door because here, in the lamplight, the world allowed them to be softer, bolder, more fully themselves than the daylight streets would ever permit. By dawn, when the shutters were drawn and the last stragglers had stumbled into the gray mist of the streets, the brothel transformed again, not into a ruin of revelry, but into a quiet, almost sacred workshop where the night's offerings were counted, weighed, and prepared anew. What could be offered in such a place was never static. It adapted to the shifting tides of taste, politics, and danger. In the Middle Ages of 1580, being able to offer more than the next house over could mean the difference between prosperity and ruin. The madam, or in some cases, the master, watched these changes as closely as a captain watches the sea, reading signs invisible to the untrained eye. A noble's recent scandal could spark a fashion for disguises. A feast at the bishop's hall might make certain wines more desirable, even if only for a week. In this world, a truly successful housekeeper became part merchant, part diplomat, part stage director. If you were a patron stepping through the door, the first offer might not be physical at all, it could be knowledge. A whisper about who had arrived in town, which merchant was close to bankruptcy, which knight was looking for someone to sponsor a duel. This information, offered casually over a goblet of red wine, was worth more than gold to those who knew how to use it. Beyond that, the house might offer tastes of faraway lands, silks dyed in shades the local dyers could never match, perfumes heavy with the resin of foreign trees, dishes cooked in styles borrowed from Moorish kitchens or the courts of Burgundy. These were not just indulgences. They were passports to worlds most patrons would never see, a way to travel without leaving the room. For the ambitious, there were introductions to powerful guests' meetings arranged as if by accident, allowing a merchant to speak to a noble over a shared plate of candied almonds, or a minor knight to catch the ear of a captain in need of a squire. The brothel became a web of connections, and the offers extended beyond pleasure into the realm of opportunity. But there were deeper, more dangerous offerings, the kind whispered about in corners, charms stitched into clothing to ensure luck in gambling or in love, tiny vials of herbal mixtures to inspire desire or to quiet it, talismans carved from bone said to guard against betrayal. Whether these worked or not mattered less than the fact that someone believed they might, and belief was a currency as powerful as coin. In some houses, especially those on the fringes of the city where the law's gaze was weaker, the offers crossed into performance that tested the edges of morality and safety. Staged hunts with wooden swords where the captured was rewarded with a private audience, or reenactments of courtly tournaments with roles assigned to patrons and companions alike. And then there were the secret rooms, known only to those whose coin and discretion matched the price. Here, the offers were shaped entirely by the guest's request, as long as it stayed within the house's unspoken code rules crafted not from morality but from survival. No matter how rich or powerful a patron might be, the housekeeper's authority here was absolute. In this hidden layer of the brothel's world, you could be offered not just companionship, but the illusion of control, the thrill of playing a role forbidden in the daylight. Some came for the quiet, for a night spent simply lying beside another human being without expectation, the kind of closeness denied to them by their station or circumstance. Others came for the opposite, for the noise, the music, the applause that greeted them like a returning hero, even if their victories were invented. And still others came for the one offer no merchant, guildmaster, or noble could give them: anonymity. Behind the brothel's walls, titles fell away, reputations were set aside, and the game was played under masks that revealed more truth than faces ever could. For in a world that prized appearances above all, perhaps the most intoxicating offer of all was the chance to be known truly, dangerously known by someone who owed you nothing, and could, if they wished, vanish into the dawn without ever speaking your name again. In the medieval cities of 1580, brothels were far from the seedy, shadowed dens of crime that later centuries would imagine. In many towns, they stood openly along busy streets, their brightly painted signs swinging over doorways as brazen as any merchant's shop. Some were even sanctioned by local authorities, who preferred to keep such activities contained rather than hidden. But the illusion of respectability was part of the lure. To survive in such a place as a patron, one had to understand that every offer made was calculated not just to satisfy, but to bind you to the house. A goblet of wine offered at the entrance was rarely just wine. It might carry a hint of spice from the east, a subtle taste that made you curious, eager for more. The madam's greeting was rehearsed, her eyes scanning you like a merchant assessing the worth of a cargo shipment. The offers began small: a choice of seat, a plate of roasted almonds, a glimpse of the musicians tuning their instruments, and each was a step deeper into the game. The companionship itself was layered in meaning. A nobleman might be offered a woman dressed in the style of a queen from a distant court, complete with a tiara of polished brass and a gown stitched with false gems. The illusion was enough to feed his fantasies without ever touching real scandal. A soldier might be paired with someone who knew the ballads of his homeland, their voice weaving the comfort of familiarity around his battle-worn soul. Beyond the physical, the brothel offered safety, at least within its walls. Here, rival merchants could drink in the same room without drawing swords, bound by an unspoken pact that whatever was said or done would never leave the premises. The staff, often far more educated than outsiders assumed, played their parts as hosts, entertainers, and discreet keepers of secrets. This safety extended to offers of mediation feuds between guild members quietly resolved over shared wine. Political alliances nudged into being under the watchful gaze of the madam. But there were darker offers too, wrapped in silk and candlelight. In some places, the brothel could provide access to substances banned elsewhere. Potent herbal mixtures from the apothecaries of Italy, rare perfumes whose ingredients were smuggled past customs, wines cut with hallucinogenic herbs that turned an evening into a fevered dream. Patrons who indulged often returned, not because the pleasure was unmatched, but because they had tasted something forbidden, and the human heart is a greedy thing for what it cannot openly have. There were also offers that blurred the lines between theater and reality. Entire evenings might be arranged as elaborate performances, a patron cast as a wandering knight, the companions as courtly ladies awaiting rescue, or even as rival claimants to a throne, acting out rivalries until the room erupted in staged betrayal. To step into such a performance was to step out of one's own life, to leave behind debts, duties, and dangers, if only for a night. And yet, beneath all the gilded offers, the brothel's heart was a place of transactions. Every laugh, every whispered secret, every shared cup was part of the price. In the Middle Ages, love and desire were often spoken of in poetry and song, but here, in the flicker of lamplight on silk, they were commodities measured, packaged, and sold with the same skill as a spice merchant hawking cinnamon in the market square. Those who understood this walked away satisfied, their purses lighter but their hearts briefly lifted. Those who forgot it risked more than coin. They risked their reputations, their safety, and sometimes their lives. For in 1580, a promise made in the heat of wine and candlelight could bind you as tightly as any contract, and breaking it might mean facing not only the wrath of the brothel's keepers, but the vengeance of those powerful enough to own both sword and city. Beyond the open allure of medieval brothels lay a second layer of offerings, subtler, quieter, yet far more dangerous for those who did not know the rules. Here, in dim back rooms perfumed with crushed rose petals and ambergris, the real trade was often information. A man could be offered the company of a beautiful woman or man, yes, but with that came the gentle, calculated art of conversation, drawing out details of where he traveled, whom he met, what cargo his ships carried, which nobles had fallen out of favor. The brothel was more than a place of pleasure. It was a living network of spies. its walls absorbing whispered secrets the way stone absorbs candle soot. These secrets could be offered to you as well, if you knew how to ask, or if the madam thought you might pay enough to make it worth her while. And secrets were worth more than gold in 1580, especially in a Europe where politics shifted like sand and a single rumor could start a war. The offers of companionship often came tailored to the patron's rank and purpose. A merchant might find himself in the company of someone who could, accidentally, mention which caravans were arriving late, giving him a chance to buy goods befit or his rivals. A traveling noble could be offered a companion who knew the gossip of the royal court, perhaps even hinting at which alliances might soon collapse. These weren't always truths, but they didn't need to be. In a world where perception shaped reality, a lie told in the right ear could be more valuable than fact. And then there were the more dangerous offers, ones that went beyond pleasure or politics. In certain brothels, for the right price, a patron could arrange for a rival to be humiliated or ruined without ever drawing a blade. A letter, dictated under the influence of wine and laughter, might find its way into the wrong hands. A patron might wake up to find a small token missing from his purse, a token that could later be planted somewhere very incriminating. Such offers were never made openly, of course. They came in the form of a playful suggestion, a mischievous glance, a softly murmured accident that would happen tomorrow if one wished it so. Even the food and drink carried meaning. The most expensive wines were often reserved for those who could be persuaded into debt, a clever trap that kept wealthy patrons returning, not just for the company, but to settle what they owed. Some dishes were seasoned with aphrodisiacs, their flavors disguised under honey or spice, not because the patron needed them, but because it deepened the illusion of the night as something irresistible, fated. In other cases, the drink was diluted, ensuring a patron remained lucid enough to spend, but not sober enough to question too closely the rising tally of his bill. For women patrons rarer but far from unheard of in 1580, the offers could be even stranger. They might be given the company of exotic performers, skilled in dances from the far reaches of the Silk Road, or a man dressed as a knight who would kneel and pledge fealty in a staged romance. To these women, the brothel was not simply a place of vice, but of fantasy, an escape from the rigid expectations of their world. But the most intoxicating offer of all was the illusion of being wanted not for your title, your money, or your power, but for yourself. This was the brothel's most dangerous magic. For a few hours, you could believe that the gaze meeting yours was not calculated, that the laughter you shared was not rehearsed, that the kiss was not part of a bargain struck before you ever walked through the door. And when you left, stepping back into the cold, suspicious air of the medieval street, that illusion could haunt you more than any debt or danger. For some, it was enough to draw them back again and again. Even knowing the truth that in 1580, love was just another trade, and the most skillful merchants in the city sold it by the hour. Yet beyond the subtle politics and whispered intrigues, there was another tier of offerings in medieval brothel services that blurred the line between pleasure, ritual, and the supernatural. In certain districts, particularly in port cities where sailors brought tales of distant lands, patrons might be offered blessings or protections for their journeys. These were not mere trinkets. They were charms woven into the evening's encounter. A companion might press a token into your palm as you left a seashell said to keep storms at bay, a sprig of dried rosemary to ward off sickness, or a scrap of cloth that had supposedly touched a saint's relic. Whether you believed in such things or not, the fact that they were given in such an intimate setting made them hard to refuse. Some brothels had wise women in back rooms, figures halfway between healer and fortune teller, who would read your palm after your pleasures were spent, whispering prophecies in the glow of fading candles. These women were often older, retired from the more physical side of the work, but their presence added a sense of mystery, making the brothel seem less like a house of vice and more like a place where fate itself could be bought. A man might come for companionship but leave convinced that his future had been altered by what he heard. Others offered performance nights, where the line between entertainment and seduction was almost non-existent. Dancers in gauzy silks would weave through the crowd, their movements telling stories of lost lovers, treacherous queens, and tragic heroes. Music drifted through the smoky air, sometimes bawdy and raucous, sometimes slow and hypnotic. Patrons were encouraged to participate, to be written into the story for a price. That participation could mean anything from playing the role of a hero in a staged romance to being mocked in jest as a foolish, noble humor that could sting later but seemed harmless under the haze of wine. And then there were the clandestine services, the ones spoken of only in hints. Certain brothels catered to desires that could not be mentioned openly in the public square, whether for the forbidden combinations of partners, the staging of elaborate fantasies, or the assumption of roles that had reversed the rigid hierarchies of medieval life. In the brothel's candlelit rooms, a servant could be a lord, a peasant could be a king, and a wealthy merchant might kneel at the feet of a woman dressed as a warrior. These reversals were intoxicating in a world where status was otherwise unshakable, and they often came with an unspoken understanding. Whatever happened in those rooms stayed there for the sake of both the patron and the house. In some regions, there was also the offer of anonymity in its purest form: masks, costumes, and entire evenings where no one spoke a name. The thrill was in not knowing who you were with, whether they were a foreign dignitary, a thief, or someone who had sworn never to set foot in such a place. That anonymity was a shield for some, a dangerous temptation for others. It was easy to forget that the person behind the mask might have their own reasons for being there, reasons that could intertwine with yours in ways neither of you could control. But every offer in a medieval brothel, no matter how strange or alluring, came with its price, not always in coin. Sometimes the price was a promise, a favor, or a small betrayal you didn't yet recognize as such. And when you stepped out into the night, you carried more than just the memory of what you had purchased. You carried the weight of a transaction that could, in the wrong hands, be turned into a weapon against you. In 1580, in the dim corridors of Europe's brothels, the most dangerous offer of all was the one you didn't realize you had accepted until it was too late. By the late 16th century, the atmosphere within these establishments had shifted to match the heightened paranoia of the age. Brothels were no longer simply private refuges for indulgence. They had become crossroads of information, rumor, and power. In cities like Paris, Venice, and Antwerp, the walls themselves seemed to have ears. Patrons stepped through the door not only for pleasure but for leverage, knowing that the right conversation overheard or the right secret coaxed from loosened lips could be worth far more than the evening's fee. And because of this, many brothels had become unofficial hubs for spies, informants, and political agents. The courtesans who worked there were often far more than they appeared. They knew the languages of merchants, the etiquette of nobility, and the slang of thieves. Their job was not merely to please, but to listen, to remember, and sometimes to report. For the unknowing visitor, this could be deadly. A careless comment about an employer's wealth, a nobleman's scandal, or a plan for the coming market week could find its way to competitors or authorities within hours. Many a man had left a brothel thinking he had enjoyed nothing more than wine and company, only to discover that his rivals were suddenly armed with his private affairs. Those who understood this danger either kept their mouths shut or came prepared with falsehoods, turning the game back upon those who sought to play them. In this way, the medieval brothel was not only a stage for seduction, but also a theater for strategy and survival. The physical spaces themselves reflected this dual nature. The front rooms were designed for warmth and welcome cushioned benches, low tables, soft lamplight casting everything in an inviting haze. But the further you went inside, the more the atmosphere changed. In back corridors, shadows clung stubbornly to the walls, and doors stood just slightly ajar, inviting the curious to listen to muffled voices. Trapdoors beneath rugs could lead to cellars where wine was stored or where meetings took place far from prying eyes. Attics were sometimes fitted with narrow slits in the floorboards, allowing someone above to observe what transpired below without ever being seen. Not every brothel owner was complicit in such schemes, but many tolerated them, knowing that powerful patrons appreciated the opportunity to conduct business in a place where their presence would draw no suspicion. After all, a lord seen entering a merchant's house might raise questions, but a lord entering a brothel was merely indulging a vice, an act so commonplace it invited no comment. This cover was invaluable, and those who ran the houses knew better than to interfere, provided the gold kept flowing. Yet beneath all of this intrigue, the core trade of the brothels still thrived, and the offerings had grown more elaborate. Role-play could now extend beyond costumes into full dramatizations, complete with props, music, and scripted lines. A merchant might reenact the conquest of a city with himself as the victorious general and a courtesan as the captured queen. A disgraced noble might live for a night as a king restored to his throne. These fantasies, while harmless in appearance, could feed ambitions that spilled beyond the brothel's walls, blurring the lines between performance and reality. And always, there was the risk that the intimacy purchased within be weaponized without. A whispered confidence shared in the glow of candlelight could return to haunt its speaker in court, in council, or in the streets. In this way, the medieval brothel of 1580 was as much a trap as it was a haven, a place where pleasure could be bought but safety never could. Every offer, every smile, every touch might conceal a blade you would not feel until the next day or the next year when the price came due. In the deeper hours of night, when the streets outside fell into that muffled silence, broken only by the distant shuffle of guards or the sudden yowl of a cat, the brothel's true nature revealed itself most clearly. Behind closed doors, the performances became less about desire and more about dominance, submission, and the playing out of unspoken power struggles. In some rooms, this meant elaborate displays of elegance, silk drapes, musicians hired to play softly in the corner, and courtesans trained not only in the arts of pleasure, but also in conversation so refined that it could rival any courtly salon. In others, the tone shifted toward the forbidden settings designed to evoke danger, with dim red light, heavy perfumes, and games that blurred the boundaries of control and trust. By 1580, the clientele had diversified far beyond the predictable noblemen and wealthy merchants. Clerics both high and low found their way inside, sometimes under hoods, sometimes brazenly in their own robes. Soldiers sought more than fleeting comfort. They craved reenactments of their campaigns, demanding role-play that mirrored the battlefields they had left behind. Traveling performers, poets, and scholars came seeking inspiration, claiming that the brothel's blend of intimacy and secrecy sparked creativity in ways no tavern ever could. For them, the rooms became stages where ideas could be tested in whispers before they were unveiled to the public. But not every patron came willingly. Debt, blackmail, and coercion were silent forces that sometimes drove men and occasionally women through the door. A rival might arrange for an enemy to be lured into a compromising position, with witnesses conveniently on hand. A political faction might use the setting to entrap someone into treasonous talk. These calculated manipulations were not spoken of in the open, but everyone who frequented the brothels knew they happened. The danger lay in never knowing whether you were the hunter or the prey in such games. The offerings themselves continued to evolve, shaped both by the demands of the clientele and by the imagination of the courtesans. Some specialized in recreating historical or mythical scenes, Helen of Troy's seduction, Cleopatra's barge, the fall of Constantinople, while others designed entirely new fantasies to satisfy the unique desires of their guests. Costumes and props were acquired from traveling merchants or commissioned from skilled artisans, ensuring each scene was vivid enough to draw the participant fully into the illusion. These were not mere distractions, they were immersive escapes that could leave one questioning where the fantasy ended and reality began. Yet even in the midst of pleasure, there was a constant undercurrent of watchfulness. Courtesans often moved between rooms with subtle glances, signaling to each other about a guest's mood, temperament, or potential threat. A spilled drink or an untied ribbon could be a deliberate sign for help or a warning to keep a distance. The brothel, for all its warmth and laughter, was a place of quiet strategy. Every worker knew that their survival depended on reading people fast, accurately, and without drawing attention to the act. And through it all, gold remained the lifeblood of the house. The more a guest spent, the more elaborate the fantasy became, and the more doors opened, both literal and metaphorical. But those who thought wealth alone could guarantee safety often learned the hard way that in such places, coin could buy you everything except control over how the night's story would end. Here in the candlelit chambers of 1580, one truth held steady. The brothel belonged to no man, no matter how rich. It belonged to its own rules, its own shadows, and to the women and men who understood that in the dance between desire and danger, the winner was always the one who could see the ending before it arrived. As dawn crept toward the city, the brothel shifted into its most delicate phase, the transition from night's indulgence to morning's reckoning. The air grew heavy with a different kind of tension, one born of partings, payments, and the careful repair of reputations. Behind closed shutters, courtesans guided their patrons back into the roles they would play in the daylight world, smoothing hair, straightening garments, and, in some cases, wiping away the painted colors that might betray where the night had been spent. This was a practiced ritual, as vital as the seductions that had preceded it. In the Middle Ages, a man's ruin could be written not only in rumors but in the faint scent of a perfume or the crease of a bed he was never meant to lie in. The workers of the house understood that their survival hinged on discretion as much as skill. They memorized alibis for their clients, recalled false details to provide if asked, and sometimes escorted them out through hidden doors that led to alleys or interconnected buildings. This clandestine architecture was as much a part of the brothel's design as its ornate public rooms' labyrinths of escape routes for those who needed to vanish without a trace. Wealthy patrons paid extra for such exits, but even they knew the safety was never absolute. A careless word, a wrong turn, or a hidden witness could undo an entire night's careful choreography. The brothel's madam, often underestimated by outsiders, was the unseen general of these operations. She kept ledgers not just of money owed, but of secrets, names, habits, weaknesses that could be leveraged if danger pressed too close. In an age where the church and crown alike condemned such establishments publicly yet relied on them privately, these records were a form of power no sword could match. Some madams used them for protection, others for profit. In either case, the knowledge held within those pages was enough to shift the balance of entire political alliances. By the year 1580, brothels had become microcosms of the larger world, places where art, lust, politics, and crime coexisted in a constant, uneasy negotiation. Courtesans might wake in the same bed as a poet one morning and a foreign envoy the next, each with their own needs and dangers. In such an environment, adaptability was not a talent, but a law of survival. A single misstep could mean exile, imprisonment, or worse. And so every smile, every gesture, every sigh had to be calculated with precision. The day's first light often carried with it an illusion of safety, but those who worked the night knew better. Morning was when the consequences began to ripple outward. A husband might return home only to find his absence noted. A bishop might deliver a sermon with a new edge of guilt in his voice. A soldier might ride out to war with a promise made in whispers still echoing in his mind. The brothel was no island. It was a mirror, reflecting back into the city all the desires, schemes, and betrayals that had unfolded under its roof. And yet, for all the danger, there was also resilience. The workers who stepped into the cool air after a long night did so with the quiet knowledge that they had navigated another round of the endless game, balancing pleasure with peril, truth with performance. The cycle would begin again with the setting sun, the candles would be lit, and new stories would be written in rooms where no two nights were ever the same. In that sense, the medieval brothel was not merely a place of flesh and coin. It was a theater where survival itself was the greatest act of all, and where, for those who knew how to play their roles, the night always offered another chance to win. By the late medieval period, the brothel's reputation had become a paradox, officially denounced, yet unofficially tolerated, and in some cities, even regulated. This contradiction created a strange kind of legitimacy for certain houses, especially those operating under the silent approval of influential patrons. In some towns, these establishments paid taxes directly to the municipal coffers, a hypocrisy that both churchmen and magistrates pretended not to notice. The reasoning was often framed as public order better, they claimed, to contain vice within specific walls than allow it to spill unchecked into the streets. In reality, it was about revenue, control, and the quiet assurance that those in power always had a place to indulge away from the eyes of the poor. These sanctioned brothels, often called stews in England or houses of tolerance on the continent, were nothing like the crude, desperate dens found in back alleys. They were more akin to private seas, lubs, with doormen, fixed prices, and codes of conduct. Clients could expect not only a bed, but an evening's entertainment music, wine, and sometimes elaborate roleplay designed to fulfill fantasies as varied as the customers themselves. For the right price, one might be dressed in silks and feathers to play a noble, or recline in a candlelit bath scented with imported oils while a courtesan read poetry in a foreign tongue. The workers in these houses were often trained in more than seduction. Many could sing, dance, or play instruments, turning an encounter into a performance. Others were skilled conversationalists, adept at discussing politics, art, or gossip, with just enough intrigue to keep a client returning. In an era where public life was rigid and stratified, these women could temporarily blur the lines of class, allowing a merchant to feel like a prince or a knight, to be treated as an equal by someone outside his rank. Such illusions were intoxicating and profitable. But the polish of these sanctioned establishments didn't erase the dangers. If a wealthy patron's affairs became known, it could spark scandal or political fallout. The courtesans were acutely aware of this, which made discretion their most valuable skill. Yet even the most careful house could be undone by jealousy, betrayal, or the shifting winds of morality. A single moral crackdown by the local bishop could see doors nailed shut, workers arrested, and property seized only for the house to reopen months later under a different name and with new faces at the helm. Some brothels thrived by aligning themselves with powerful protectors, guild leaders, city officials, or even members of the royal court. This patronage came at a cost, often in the form of loyalty and silence. Courtesans might be called upon to entertain guests at private banquets or to act as informants, listening for useful scraps of intelligence in the company of loose-tongued clients. In this way, the brothel became more than a house of pleasure. It became a node in the city's network of influence, a place where secrets could be traded as easily as gold. By the year 1580, the political role of brothels was an open secret. A clever madam could broker alliances, soften rivalries, or sabotage enemies simply by controlling access to certain workers. These women, in turn, learned to wield their own subtle power, using charm not only to earn coin but to position themselves in the games of men who thought themselves players, never realizing they were being played in turn. It was a dangerous balance. But for those who mastered it, the rewards were unmatched. And in the shadowy world of medieval politics, few places offered such a vantage point as the candlelit chambers of a well-run brothel. If the daylight world of the medieval city was governed by the rigid structures of guilds, councils, and church bells, the brothel was a place where time itself seemed to bend. Candles burned late into the night, shadows danced on painted walls, and conversations stretched into hours, unbound by curfews or formalities. Patrons arrived seeking more than flesh. They came for escape, for the illusion of freedom from their titles, debts, and duties. In this sense, the brothel served as a kind of theater, each visitor stepping into a role, each worker a performer who could make fantasy feel real for as long as the candles lasted. Some houses cultivated an exotic atmosphere, decorating their chambers with imported silks, Moorish lanterns, or tapestries depicting far-off lands. These embellishments appealed to the growing curiosity of a Europe expanding its trade routes and its imagination. To walk into such a room and be greeted by a courtesan dressed as an Eastern princess or a pagan goddess was to be transported far from the cobbled streets outside. The art of seduction here was not simply physical, it was immersive. A story spun around the client until he believed himself the hero of a tale written only for him. In others, the experience leaned toward intimacy rather than spectacle. Here, the rooms were small but warm, the beds layered with soft blankets, the lighting low and forgiving. Conversation flowed easily, and the courtesan's skill lay in listening as much as in speaking. Many clients, especially older men or those worn by political life, came not for passion but for the comfort of being heard without judgment. These women in turn became keepers of countless confidences, storing fragments of stories, quarrels, and schemes knowledge that could be both a shield and a weapon. Payment structures varied widely. Some brothels charged by the hour, others by the evening, and the most exclusive might require a membership fee. Wine, food, and extras were billed separately, and a clever madam knew how to weave these luxuries into the evening so seamlessly that a client left lighter of purse without ever feeling cheated. Regulars were often rewarded with small tokens, a silk ribbon, a private sode-enge, or the promise of priority on busy nights. These gestures built loyalty, ensuring a steady flow of income even in lean times. The women themselves were bound to the brothel in different ways. Some worked under contract, their earnings split with the madam. Others were effectively employees, paid a wage but with less freedom to choose their clients. In the more refined houses, courtesans could negotiate their own terms, refusing patrons they disliked or arranging longer engagements with those they preferred. This autonomy was rare, but it offered a measure of safety and dignity in a trade where both could vanish in an instant. Yet, no matter how elegant the facade, the risk of violence or exploitation never vanished. A drunken client could become aggressive, a jealous rival might spread rumors, or an unpaid debt could bring the wrath of dangerous creditors. To survive in this world required a constant vigilance, an ability to read the flicker in a man's eyes or the shift in his tone before trouble erupted. For many courtesans, these instincts became second nature, an unspoken skill as vital as beauty or wit. And in the back rooms, where the madam counted coins and planned the next evening's entertainment, everyone knew the truth. A medieval brothel was not simply a place of pleasure, but a stage where survival and performance were inseparable, and where every night could bring either fortune or ruin. In the most renowned brothels, reputation was cultivated as carefully as the wine list. Word of mouth spread through taverns, marketplaces, and whispered exchanges between nobles, carrying tales of nights so decadent they bordered on legend. Some of these houses even maintained menus of services written for literate patrons or described in elaborate detail for those who could not read. These menus were less a catalogue of acts and more an art form, filled with poetic euphemisms designed to intrigue without offending sensibilities. A dance of the moon might mean an evening of music, drink, and slow undressing, while the voyage to the Isles hinted at pleasures that were far less innocent. Such language was not only part of the mystique, it was a safeguard. In an era when accusations of immorality could lead to fines, public shaming, or closure by the city watch, discretion was everything. The madam, therefore, walked a delicate line between enticing clients and protecting her establishment from the eyes of the church and law. Confessionals across Europe heard the sins of men who had visited such houses, but names were rarely spoken aloud. Silence was the price of survival, and those who broke it risked far more than social embarrassment. Inside, every detail of the evening was orchestrated. The moment a client stepped through the door, he was enveloped in a sensory cocoon perfumed air, candlelight softening every flaw, music that masked the sounds of the street outside. In more luxurious brothels, minstrels might play in the common room, their melodies setting the rhythm of the night. In others, the soundscape was more intimate. The low hum of conversation, the clink of a cup being refilled, the occasional burst of laughter from behind a curtain. The courtesans themselves were masters of transformation. Some could change their entire persona from one evening to the next, becoming a demure maiden for one client and a bold temptress for another. They adapted not only their clothing but their voice, their gestures, even their choice of words to match the fantasies of the man before them. This chameleon-like skill was part of what set the great courtesans apart from their less successful peers. It was not enough to simply be beautiful. One had to be unforgettable. In certain cities, such as Venice or Paris, the most prestigious courtesans wielded influence that extended far beyond the bedroom. They could introduce patrons to valuable political contacts, pass along gossip that could change the course of a business deal, or lend their presence to a gathering in a way that elevated its status. A nobleman might visit a brothel not for pleasure at all, but for the opportunity to converse privately with someone who had the ear of merchants, artists, and officials alike. But the opulence and influence came with its own kind of peril. A courtesan who became too closely associated with one powerful man risked being seen as his property, while one who spread her favors too widely could lose the exclusivity that made her desirable. Balancing these dynamics was an unending negotiation, and it required as much strategy as any political court. The stakes were high. A fall from favor could be swift and merciless, stripping away the silks and jewels to leave nothing but debts and whispers. In this way, the medieval brothel existed at the crossroads of danger and delight, a place where beauty, wit, and survival instincts wove together into a fragile web. To the uninitiated, it was a house of pleasure. To those who lived and worked within its walls, it was a battleground fought with smiles, silk ribbons, and whispered secrets, a world where the wrong word could cost you everything, and the right one could keep you alive for another night. Beyond the candlelit rooms and whispered bargains, medieval brothels were also engines of commerce and survival. For many women, especially those without family or dowry, entering such an establishment was less a choice born of vice than one born of necessity. Life outside those walls could mean relentless hunger, grueling labor for pennies, or the constant risk of assault in unprotected streets. Inside, there was at least a roof, meals, and the possibility, however slim, of earning enough to secure a more stable future. But that security came with a price. The madam claimed a share of every coin, and debt to the house for clothing, food, or lodging could keep a woman bound there for years. The economics of the trade were stark. In smaller towns, a brothel might see only a handful of patrons each week, forcing its workers to also sell ale, food, or even perform domestic tasks for local merchants. In major cities, however, competition was fierce, and the pressure to remain alluring was constant. This meant investing in perfumes, fine fabrics, and cosmetics, all of which were expensive and often sourced from far-off markets. Saffron for hair dye, imported from the East, could cost a week's earnings. A bolt of silk from Italy could take months to pay off. Some brothels formed alliances with taverns, theaters, or gambling dens, creating a circuit of entertainment that kept patrons circulating between establishments, spending freely. These alliances also provided protection. If trouble broke out in the streets, the madam could call on her partners to intervene, or at least to warn her of raids and moral crackdowns ordered by the local authorities. In some cases, these alliances extended to the church itself, whose clergy, despite public condemnation, often benefited from discreet payments to look the other way. The brothels of port cities like Marseille, Bruges, and London had a particularly transient clientele, sailors with gold in their pockets and weeks of deprivation behind them. For these men, a night in a brothel was not just about intimacy, it was a chance to feel human again, to eat, to drink, to laugh in the company of someone who smiled at them without command. For the courtesans, such clients were both a blessing and a curse. Generous in the moment, but gone the next day, leaving no guarantee of return. In more rural areas, brothels took on a different character. They were smaller, more discreet, often operating from the back rooms of inns or private homes. These places lacked the velvet and gold of their urban counterparts, but they could be more dangerous, as they had fewer resources to ward off violent patrons or official harassment. The women there often worked without the protection of a madam, making them vulnerable to exploitation by anyone with more power, be it a local constable or a traveling merchant. Yet even in such harsh conditions, camaraderie could flourish. The women looked out for one another, sharing food, medicine, and warnings about dangerous clients. They formed bonds that could last a lifetime, forged in the shared understanding of what it took to survive in a world that saw them as both temptation and sin. Within those walls, whether adorned with silks or simple linens, the truth was the same. The brothel was less a place of wickedness than a shelter in a storm made not of weather, but of judgment, poverty, and the relentless demands of survival. The deeper you stepped into the underbelly of medieval brothels, the clearer it became that these establishments operated under a complex code of unwritten rules designed to balance profit, safety, and the ever-present need to placate both customers and authorities. For all their notoriety, brothels often relied on a strange sort of diplomacy. The madam, for instance, was as much a politician as she was a businesswoman. She had to know the moods of the town, the power struggles between the church and the crown, the shifting alliances of merchants, and which constable could be bribed with coin or with silence. One wrong move, one insult to the wrong man, could lead to a raid that shut the doors forever. Inside, the atmosphere was carefully crafted to suit the clientele. In the wealthier districts, the walls might be draped with imported tapestries, the air thick with the scent of burning incense from the Levant, and musicians playing lutes or viols in the corner. The women would be dressed in bright silks, their hair arranged in elaborate styles, their skin powdered to create an air of refinement. In these brothels, the service was as much about theater as it was about the act itself. Clients were paying for the illusion of courtly love, for the fantasy of being a knight in a private romance. In poorer houses, the glamour was stripped away. Wooden benches replaced cushioned chairs, candles burned low to save on wax, and ale was served from a common jug. Yet even here, a sense of ritual persisted. Clients expected certain courtesies, certain signs of attention, and the women knew how to deliver them, whether with a lingering glance, a playful jest, or the promise of a story whispered in the dark. In these dimly lit rooms, intimacy was not just a commodity, it was a survival tactic, a way to keep patrons loyal in a market that had no shortage of competition. Payment was another intricate dance. While a coin was preferred, brothels often accepted goods in lieu of money, bolts of cloth, barrels of wine, spices, or even livestock. This barter system meant that a single night's work might feed the house for weeks or clothe its workers in finery. But it also meant the madam had to be as skilled in trade negotiations as any merchant in the marketplace. A patron might leave without paying in gold, but if he left behind a cask of imported wine, it could fetch double the value when sold to a local tavern. The relationship between brothels and the surrounding community was fraught with contradiction. Publicly, moralists and church officials denounced them as dens of sin. Privately, many of those same voices visited under the cover of night. Townsfolk might gossip and sneer, yet rely on the brothel as a discreet outlet for desires that would otherwise disrupt households and reputations. Some municipalities even taxed brothels openly, funneling the income into public works, all while preaching about chastity and virtue. What was perhaps most striking was the dual identity of the women themselves. Outside the brothel, they were marked, their reputations shadowed, denied entry into certain churches, and shunned in polite company. Inside, they could be queens in their own domain, commanding attention, dictating terms, and crafting the roles they would play for each visitor. In this way, the brothel became more than a place of transaction. It was a stage, a fortress, and sometimes even a sanctuary, where the most dangerous weapon was not beauty or desire, but the ability to read a man's mind and give him precisely what he thought he wanted while keeping enough of herself hidden to survive another night. Yet beneath the painted smiles and rehearsed gestures, danger lingered like a shadow that never left the doorway. A woman's survival in a medieval brothel was not only about pleasing clients. It was about navigating threats that could arrive in the form of drunken brawls, jealous wives, envious rivals, or the ever-watchful eyes of the law. Even a well-connected madam could not guarantee protection from every hazard. A single accusation of theft, witchcraft, or spreading disease could bring the wrath of the authorities, and such accusations were often fabricated by competitors or spurned patrons. Violence, though not constant, was an accepted risk. Patrons, emboldened by drink or arrogance, sometimes tested the limits of the house's patience. The brothel's hired guards, often former soldiers or mercenaries, were not there merely for show. They acted swiftly to drag out troublemakers, but the cost of such altercations was high. Injuries could leave a worker unable to earn for weeks, and in a world where most had no family or safety net, such a pause could mean starvation. The church, for all its moral posturing, added another layer of danger. In certain towns, sermons would be aimed directly at brothel workers, branding them as agents of the devil. In more zealous regions, inquisitors could order raids under the pretense of moral cleansing. Sometimes the raids were genuine. Other times they were excuses to extort money or seize property. A madam with political skill might bribe her way out of trouble, but she had to do so without appearing too openly corrupt, lest she invite even harsher scrutiny. Disease was another ever-present specter. Without an understanding of germs, brothels relied on rituals and superstitions for protection, washing in vinegar, wearing talismans, or burning certain herbs to purify the air. While some houses were surprisingly clean for the era, others were breeding grounds for infections that could spread rapidly, among the women and their clients. A sick worker was often forced to continue until she could no longer stand, her place quickly filled by another desperate soul. And yet, despite all of this, many women saw the brothel as their best or only path to autonomy. For some, it meant escaping an abusive household. For others, it was a chance to earn more than they ever could as a laundress or maid. The brothel could provide food, shelter, and even a form of community among its workers, bound together by shared hardship and the need to look out for one another. Within these walls, alliances were formed, secrets shared, and survival strategies passed down like inherited wisdom. In a society that granted women so little control over their own fates, the brothel offered a paradoxical freedom one purchased at the highest of costs. It was a world where every word, glance, and gesture carried weight, where fortunes could be made or lost in a single night, and where the true art lay not in seduction, but in endurance. The women who thrived here were not merely entertainers. They were tacticians, traders, and survivors in a game that few outside these dimly lit rooms would ever truly understand. By the turn of the late Middle Ages, certain cities had begun formalizing the existence of brothels, turning them into regulated, taxable businesses. Municipal records from places like Avignon, Nuremberg, and Bruges detail licenses issued to madams, fees collected for each worker, and even public ordinances dictating where such establishments could operate. This legalization brought a strange duality. On paper, the brothel was part of the civic economy, tolerated as a necessary evil meant to keep male desire from threatening respectable households. In practice, it remained a stigmatized underworld, its workers confined to the margins of polite society. These licensed brothels often operated in designated districts, sometimes marked with symbols, lanterns, painted doors, or even municipal signs. The reasoning was pragmatic: keep the trade contained, visible, and therefore controllable. But such visibility also meant vulnerability. A known brothel could be targeted during times of unrest. Drunken mobs, religious zealots, or gangs looking to send a message could storm the premises under the flimsiest pretexts. City guards might intervene, but just as often they would turn a blind eye unless bribed. Inside the regulated houses, the routines became almost ritualized. A woman might spend her mornings tending to her appearance, her afternoons preparing the rooms, making beds, arranging linens, checking the perfumed oils or wines on offer, and her evenings engaged with clients. Meals were often communal, eaten in the kitchen or shared quarters, a time to exchange gossip about patrons, warn of dangerous customers, or share news about the authorities. The brothel thus became its own self-contained society, with its own hierarchies, unspoken rules, and methods of justice. The madam's role in such a system was both that of a business owner and an enforcer. She kept ledgers of earnings, calculated each woman's share after deductions for rent, clothing, and house expenses, and maintained relationships with suppliers, everything from wine merchants to laundresses who cleaned the linens. She also determined punishments for workers who broke house rules, whether that meant refusing a patron without cause, creating trouble with the law, or attempting to leave with unpaid debts. Patrons of regulated brothels could include merchants, sailors, visiting dignitaries, or even clergy. The church, despite its official disapproval, often looked the other way. Some priests and monks were among the most frequent visitors. To justify this contradiction, moralists argued that such places protected virtuous women by giving men a sanctioned outlet for their desires, an argument that did little to change the lives of those within the walls. But regulation did not guarantee safety. A license did not protect a brothel from sudden closure under political pressure, nor from punitive fines imposed to make an example of its immorality. Workers could find themselves evicted overnight with no recourse, forced back into the streets or into the hands of less reputable establishments. Even in the most respectable licensed brothel, survival required constant awareness of the shifting winds of politics, the moods of clients, and the delicate balance between visibility and discretion. In this way, the medieval brothel was a strange reflection of the wider world outside its doors. Structured, hierarchical, often brutal, but full of unwritten codes that could mean the difference between ruin and survival. Those who lived and worked there learned quickly that while the law might recognize their existence, it would never truly be on their side. If the licensed brothel was the polished face of the trade, then the unlicensed houses and street operations were its raw, unpredictable shadow. These illicit spaces often sprang up in cramped alleys, abandoned buildings, or makeshift rooms above tavern. They offered cheaper services than their regulated counterparts, attracting soldiers between campaigns, laborers paid by the day, and those unwilling or unable to pay the higher rates of a licensed house. But the low cost came with risk. These unregulated brothels were hidden from official oversight, which meant no protection from the city guard, no guaranteed cleanliness, and no promise that a patron would leave with his purse or his life intact. In such places, the madam might not even be a permanent figure. Sometimes the manager was a transient criminal, a gambler who used the women's earnings to fund his debts, or a tavern keeper who rented a back room for quick encounters. The workers here lived in a state of constant instability. On one night, the place could be buzzing with laughter, music, and the clinking of mugs. The next, it could be abandoned, the women scattered to avoid a sudden raid. Survival depended on being able to pack up everything they owned, often just a small bundle of clothes and personal items within minutes. Violence was common. Without the veneer of municipal protection, disputes between patrons and workers could escalate quickly. A client who refused to pay, a drunken fight between rivals, or a brawl sparked by jealousy could leave bodies in the street. The women, in many cases, relied on each other for defense, forming tight-knit bonds born of necessity. Some carried small blades hidden in their bodices, others relied on coded signals to warn of danger. A sharp knock at the door, a whistle through the window, these could mean the difference between a quick escape and a beating. But despite the danger, many women preferred these shadowy operations to licensed brothels. In a regulated house, debts to the madam could keep a worker trapped for years, her earnings siphoned away in endless house fees. In an illegal setting, there was at least the possibility of keeping a larger share, or of leaving without asking permission. Freedom came at a high cost, but to some, it was worth the gamble. The clients who frequented these hidden establishments often came for more than physical intimacy. Here they could indulge in fantasies or fetishes forbidden in more respectable venues. The lack of oversight meant the rules were looser, the performances bolder. Some houses staged private role-playing scenarios, complete with costumes and props. Others specialized in music, dance, and intoxicants, blurring the line between brothel and underground club. Yet, the same qualities that drew patrons also drew predators. Thieves sometimes posed as customers to scout the premises before robbing the place. Corrupt guards demanded bribes to keep the doors open, and failing to pay could mean a violent raid. If a woman was injured, there was no appeal to the law. Her injuries would be her own burden to bear, and if she could not work, she could not eat. These unlicensed spaces existed in a constant state of motion, always shifting to avoid the gaze of authority. Some lasted only weeks before being shuttered. Others, run by shrewd operators who knew how to bribe the right officials, could remain open for years. In both cases, the women who worked there learned a brutal truth. In the medieval sex trade, stability was an illusion, and survival meant adapting faster than the dangers closing in around you. For those who drifted between the licensed and unlicensed worlds, the reality was a delicate balancing act. A woman might spend months in a regulated brothel, earning enough to survive but constantly under the watchful eye of the madam and the authorities, then slip away to work in the shadows when debts became unbearable or the rules too suffocating. Others moved in the opposite direction, starting in the streets or hidden houses, until danger or exhaustion pushed them toward the relative order of a licensed establishment. This constant movement was not always by choice. Rumors, accusations, or the whims of a powerful client could force sudden relocations. In the medieval trade, reputation was as fragile as glass, and once cracked, it could never truly be restored. There was also the nomadic tier of the profession traveling prostitutes who followed fairs, tournaments, pilgrimages, and seasonal markets. These women carried their livelihood on their backs, setting up in tents, makeshift stalls, or rented rooms above taverns. While they avoided the long-term entrapment of debt to a brothel, they faced other perils. Sleeping in unsafe lodgings, relying on strangers for protection, and competing with local workers who might see them as threats. Their work was unpredictable. One night could bring a flood of wealthy merchants eager to spend. The next could pass in hunger and cold. The dangers of the road were legendary. Bandits targeted traveling sex workers not only for money but for the cruel satisfaction of violence. Unscrupulous innkeepers might lock them in, demanding they serve guests for free, or pay inflated room fees they could never hope to afford. Sometimes local authorities would round them up on charges of vagrancy or moral corruption, stripping them of their belongings and forcing them to leave town under threat of whipping. Yet for some, the road offered a kind of liberation. It meant never staying long enough to be trapped by a single patron, never being bound by the rigid rules of one city's moral code. A clever traveler could learn the customs of each place where the guards could be bribed, which districts allowed discreet trade, which tavern owners welcomed extra income from upstairs rooms. The most successful itinerants became legends in their own right, known across regions by nicknames or whispered descriptions. Their movements tracked not by law, but by those eager to find them again. The spectrum of the medieval sex trade was wider and more complex than moralists of the era ever admitted. From the gilded chambers of high-class courtesans to the cold, damp corners of illegal alleyway rooms, each space carried its own rules, dangers, and fleeting rewards. But in every corner of this world, one truth remained constant. Those who survived did so by mastering a ruthless skill, reading the room, the street, and the shifting mood of the age, and knowing exactly when to stay, when to charm, and when to vanish into the night. In the twilight streets of a medieval city, where cobblestones glistened with the refuse of the day, and the scent of smoke and ale hung heavy in the air, the brothel was not merely a place of flesh. It was a theater, a marketplace, a confessional, and sometimes a trap. The most successful houses cultivated an atmosphere meant to disarm and intoxicate. Candles burned in iron sconces, casting wavering light on walls draped with heavy tapestries to muffle sound. The air was perfumed not just with flowers, but with exotic resins like frankincense or ambergris, masking the reality of sweat and wine. Patrons entered these spaces already half willing to forget the outside world, drawn into an environment where time seemed to slow and the rules of ordinary life dissolved. Inside, the women sometimes men played roles as carefully crafted as any noble court mask. There were those who presented themselves as mysterious and aloof, speaking in half-sentences and letting silence work as seduction. Others adopted a maternal warmth, offering comfort along with pleasure, their laps as much for weeping confessions as for lust. Still others played the part of the dangerous, unattainable lover, their company a prize to be earned through extravagant spending. It was a performance in layers, and the most skilled could read a man's posture, his accent, the quality of his shoes, and know within moments whether to flatter, tease, or feign disinterest until his purse loosened. Yet behind the velvet curtains and wine cups lay a reality that was far less romantic. The Madam's ledger was the true ruler of the house. Every gown, every jeweled pin, every flask of spiced wine poured for a client appeared later as a debt, subtracted from the night's earnings. A courtesan might find herself owing more after a month than when she arrived, not because she had failed to work, but because the very tools of her trade clothes, scent, a room to receive clients were rented to her at merciless rates. Some houses cloaked this in courtesy, referring to debts as advances or gifts, but all knew that repayment was expected, and leaving without settling the balance could mean public shaming, arrest, or worse. In the quieter corners, away from the laughter and music, deals were struck between madams and city officials. Protection money, discreetly folded into purses, ensured that raids were rare, or that certain respectable clients could enter without fear of scandal. The church, officially condemning such houses, often benefited indirectly through donations from wealthy patrons eager to cleanse their conscience, or even from fines levied against the workers themselves, which found their way into ecclesiastical coffers. This uneasy dance between moral condemnation and financial exploitation was one of the most enduring contradictions of the age. For the workers themselves, survival required navigating not only the moods of clients, but the shifting alliances of the brothel's own hierarchy. New arrivals were tested, sometimes kindly, sometimes cruelly, by veterans who decided whether the newcomer was a threat, an ally, or an easy victim. Friendships formed in such places could be deep, forged in shared risk and mutual defense. But betrayals were equally common, a whispered rumor or a stolen patron turning allies into rivals overnight. Trust was currency, rare, and often spent too quickly. The deeper into the night the brothel fell, the more its true nature revealed itself. In the early evening, the rooms near the entrance bustled with flirtation, laughter, and the gentle clinking of goblets. By midnight, the upstairs chambers had become sanctuaries of secrecy, places where whispers carried more weight than moans, and where a drunken slip of the tongue could be worth more than gold. Many courtesans were as much spies as lovers, memorizing the names dropped during pillow talk, the alliances hinted at over shared wine, the rivalries confessed in a moment of lust-dulled candor. These fragments of information, carefully passed to the right ears, could buy protection, favor, or even a chance to leave the trade entirely. But such games were dangerous. The wrong word, repeated to the wrong person, could seal a fate. Men who feared exposure sometimes returned not for pleasure, but for vengeance. Doors would be locked from the outside, and a woman's laughter could die mid-breath, when she saw the glint of a dagger instead of the glint of coin. Some brothels kept their own guards, hulking men who knew when to step in and when to turn their backs. These guards were not purely for the workers' safety. They were also there to ensure the client's debts were paid before they left, and that no one dared take the madam's property, human or otherwise, without permission. For certain patrons, Money bought more than bodies, it bought fantasies made flesh. In some houses, entire rooms were staged to mimic exotic lands. Silken tents with painted walls of desert landscapes, or heavy northern firs spread before a roaring fire. Others catered to the darker appetites of the time, offering what the church called perversions, but what wealthy nobles considered harmless indulgence so long as it stayed hidden. These acts were rarely discussed outside the walls, for the punishments for unnatural pleasures were as severe as those for witchcraft. Still, the knowledge of who enjoyed such things gave the brothel's mistress a power that could rival that of a bishop. The constant presence of disease was another shadow over the trade. Physicians, when they were called, often arrived too late, prescribing purges or poultices that did little against the pox or the flux. In some cities, laws required brothel workers to be inspected weekly, but these inspections were often cursory, meant more to appease the public than to protect the women. Rumors swirled about certain houses where infected workers were kept hidden from the authorities until they could recover or until their condition worsened to the point where they vanished entirely. Death in such cases was not marked by ceremony. The body might be carried out at dawn, covered in a coarse sheet, and left at the gates of a potter's field. And yet, for all the dangers, many chose to stay. For some, it was the only life they had ever known. For others, it was still better than the grinding poverty of fieldwork or servitude in a noble household. A clever courtesan could amass wealth if she was lucky, if she was careful, if she knew when to feign ignorance and when to demand her due. A few even managed to marry into the nobility, though such stories were the exception, held up as proof that the game could be won when, in truth, the odds were stacked against them from the start. By the waning hours before dawn, the brothel became a place of ghosts. The laughter that once rang through its corridors faded to murmurs, the music slowed, and the air thickened with the scent of sweat, spilled wine, and candle smoke curling into the rafters. The courtesans, their painted faces smudged and hair loosened from elaborate styles, moved like shadows between rooms, collecting coins, coaxing the last reluctant clients to finish their drinks, or slipping away themselves to sleep in narrow, creaking beds in the attic. Downstairs, the madam would tally the night's earnings by the flicker of a single lamp, her fingers moving over coins with the precision of a priest counting rosary beads. Every copper was accounted for, every unpaid debt noted for collection. Outside, the streets were cold and damp, slick with mist from the nearby river. In these hours, danger shifted shape from the scheming nobility who visited under cover of night to the thieves and drunkards who haunted the alleys. Workers leaving for home walked quickly, their shawls pulled tight, some with hidden daggers tucked beneath their skirts. Those who stayed inside until sunrise knew it was safer, though safer did not mean safe. Jealousy could flare even in the quietest hours, and arguments over a favored client sometimes ended in broken glass or blood on the floor. The guards, weary but alert, stationed themselves by the door like stone sentinels until the last lock clicked shut. And yet, for all its shadows, the brothel was a place of strange resilience. Friendships formed in the spaces between danger and desire sisters not by blood but by survival. They tended to each other's wounds, shared their small luxuries, and whispered warnings about cruel clients or dangerous nobles. A loaf of stolen bread, a vial of perfume from a forgetful lord's pocket, a bright ribbon found in the gutter, these became small victories in a life that demanded them daily. In a world where the church and the law condemned them, the women created their own codes, their own loyalties, their own ways to protect one another when no one else would. When the first light broke over the city's rooftops, the brothel shifted once more. Curtains were drawn tight, the hearths were banked, and the building seemed to sink into silence, as though holding its breath until night returned. The day would bring market sellers shouting in the streets, children chasing each other through alleys, and city guards making their rounds. But here, behind shuttered windows, another kind of world waited patiently to awaken again. And as the city moved on, unaware or unwilling to see, The secrets whispered in the dark settled into the walls like smoke, lingering long after the candles had been snuffed out.